Good morning. Thank you for tuning in. Last week we talked about Joshua. We're in Joshua chapter 1, and Joshua is given this command to be strong and courageous, to remember that God is with him, because he has been chosen to replace Moses as the leader who would lead God's people into the promised land. And we wanted to take that whole idea of how we deal with what's right in front of us and take those same important truths with us as we think about whatever it is that we're trying to deal with. And so we want to be strong, we want to be courageous, we want to know that God is with us, and we want to believe that everything that God promises us is true. And so we started to talk about those things using Joshua as an example. And I wanted to clear something up, because last week I actually made a mistake in my sermon. I referenced later in the book of Joshua them sending men into the promised land to give a report, to tell the leaders what they saw. And that actually doesn't take place in Joshua. That's back in Numbers chapter 13, when Moses actually sends these men into the promised land to kind of spy out and find out what the land looks like. And they go back and they give a bad report because they're afraid of the people who live there. The spies that are sent out in the book of Joshua, they are not scaredy cats like the other ones. And so that's a different story, and I got mixed up, and so I just wanted you to know that. Today we're going to be in Joshua chapter 6, where we look at the fall of Jericho. And this is a story that, if you grew up going to church, you knew about this story, because it was kind of one of those fun stories where the walls fall down, something kind of amazing happens. And so there is that aspect of the story where it's really interesting, but there's some just super practical things that come out of this story. And so that's what I want to focus on as we read through this. Before we jump in, just to kind of bring you from Joshua 1 to Joshua chapter 6, in chapter 2, Joshua sends spies to Jericho to spy out the city. That was what mixed me up with the other spies. And they are helped by a prostitute whose name is Rahab. They are able to hide in her house. And so Rahab helps them, and they promise to preserve her life and the life of her family members when they come to destroy the city later on. After that, in chapters 3 and 4, it tells the story of the people actually crossing into the promised land, crossing the Jordan River, and there's this echo of the Exodus and the parting of the Red Sea. In the story, the people cross the Jordan River on dry ground after the ark goes ahead of them. And so it's kind of like this reminder that God is still with us. God is still doing miraculous things for us. God is still delivering us. And I think it's a good reminder for the people to know that as they enter into the promised land, as they deal with what's right in front of them. In chapter 5, there's this kind of renewal of the covenant. The men are circumcised, which kind of denotes that they are separate and they're different from the people whose land they have come to conquer, to take. And also in chapter 5, they keep the they keep the Passover. And so that festival, that feast that reminds them of what God is doing for them, what God has done for them, they celebrate that. And they're reminded of deliverance. And so there's a lot kind of that happens before they go against this first city in battle, to remind them that they belong to God. God has done many good things for them, and he will continue to do good things for them if they continue to live within that relationship, within that covenant that they have with him. And so let's start reading in chapter 6. It says, "Now the gates of Jericho were securely barred because of the Israelites. No one went out, and no one came in. And the Lord said to Joshua, See, I have delivered Jericho into your hands, along with its king and its fighting men. So march around the city once with all the armed men, and do this for 6 days. Have 7 priests carry trumpets of ram's horns in front of the ark. And on the 7th day, march around the city 7 times, with the priests blowing the trumpets. And when you hear them sound a long blast on the trumpet, have the whole army give a loud shout. And then the wall of the city will collapse, and the army will go up, everyone straight in. And so, God's people, the first city that they encounter as they journey into the promised land to try to take that land for themselves, is this city, Jericho. And it's a city that has walls around it. So it's a fortified city. It wouldn't have been an easy place to take and siege. But God has this plan for them and a way that he wants them to do it that will deliver the city into their hands. And so let's kind of, for a second, let's think about the thing that we talked about last week. What is right in front of you? And we talked about how for every person it's different, and yet every person has something that they are dealing with, something that's right in front of them. I talked about how for me and my wife, it's our children. We are raising our kids, and that's kind of what's right in front of us. It takes up a lot of our focus, a lot of our energy, a lot of our efforts, a lot of our prayers. And so that's what's right in front of us, but there's something that's right in front of you. Maybe it's school. Maybe you're still in school, or you're getting an education. Maybe it's your job. Maybe you're still kind of in the, you're still working. You're still in that stage of your life where you have a career. Maybe, like a lot of the people in this congregation, you are now retired and you're thinking in terms of, what am I going to do with the rest of my life? And maybe you're in this place where you're kind of, you know that you probably have another 10 or 15 years left. It's the last quarter of your life. The question is, how are we going to push into that? How are we going to deal with what's right in front of us? And the strategies that we see here are going to be relevant to anybody, regardless of what stage of life they're in. And so this is, I think, something that could be very important for all of us. The question that we want to ask is, how do I press into raising children? How do I press into marriage? How do I press into work? Or how do I press into retirement with faith? With the strength and the courage that God commands? How do I press into it knowing that God is with me? And so we're gonna learn some of that, see some of that here in Joshua chapter 6. So the very first thing that I want to bring out of this is just how important it is to pay attention to what God says about specific things. So, as the Israelites journey into the Promised Land, this is only the first of many cities that they're going to have to conquer. It's not like they just need to conquer Jericho and then the rest of the Promised Land is theirs. This is the first one of many that they encounter. And yet it's the only time where God tells them to do this specific thing, where they're supposed to march around the city a certain number of times for a certain number of days. They don't do that at any of the other cities that they come up against. And so I think that there's this idea here that God has specific instructions for specific things. And that's true in whatever it is that you're pressing into, whatever it is that's right in front of you. It's important to pay attention to what God says about that specifically. Now, you might say, well, God doesn't say anything specifically about, working a 9 to 5 or things like that. And I understand that. That's true. But as far as like the general idea of what's right in front of you, it might be marriage and your relationship with your husband or with your wife. It might be raising children, your relationship with your kids. It might be just work in general, or an education in general, or aging in general. All of those, you could find them in Scripture. You could find specific instructions that have to do with that. And so the same way that God's people here needed to pay special attention to what God says about Jericho, this is only about Jericho. This isn't how you're going to do it in other places. We need to go to God's Word and look for specific instructions about that thing. And so one example that I want to make is marriage. And so let's flip over to Ephesians chapter 5. And so let's say that the thing that's right in front of you is marriage. Either you're going to get married, or you've been married, but your marriage needs maybe some help. Maybe you need to work on your marriage, which the truth is that we all need to. We all need to pay attention to our marriages. We need to continually be investing in our marital relationship. Ephesians chapter 5, verses 22, and then we're going to look at 25 also. But passages like this, Ephesians chapter 5 and Ephesians chapter 6, are super specific. This is a letter from Paul to the church in Ephesus, but it's very specific, and it says here, it gives instructions that are specific to the marital relationship. Verse 22 says, "Wives, submit yourselves to your own husbands as you do to the Lord." Or in other versions it says, "Wives, respect your husbands." And then in verse 25 it goes on and it says, "Husbands, love your wives, just as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her, to make her holy, cleansing her by the washing with water through the word." The idea there is that God has specific instructions for wives and for husbands. And we need to pay attention to those commands within the context of marriage. Now, God doesn't say anything about respecting and loving your neighbor in this sense. It doesn't say anything about respecting and loving your children in this sense. This doesn't talk about respecting and loving the governing authorities. This is a specific instruction for marriage. Wives, respect your husbands. Husbands, love your wives. And so there's a very real context for this command. The same way that there was a very real and specific context for the commands that were given to the people when they were going to take Jericho. You're going to march around it every day for 6 days. On the seventh day, you're going to march around it 7 times, and then the walls are going to fall down. And so that's important for us to do. So when you're thinking in terms of, okay, this is what's right in front of me, as you look through Scripture, yes, there's vague things that might guide you a little bit in that, but always look for the specific instructions. Look for the specific commands, and don't take those outside of that context. That's another important thing to do, is not to take those outside of that context. In the next chapter, in chapter 8, there's another city called Ai, and that city, the instructions for that city are going to be different. And so it's important, as we pay attention to what God is telling us about what's right in front of us and how He wants us to press into that and deal with it, that we pay attention to that. Now, let's talk a little bit about what God actually told them to do, and we can keep reading a little bit. And so in verse 6 it says, "Joshua son of Nun called the priests and said to them, 'Take up the ark of the covenant of the Lord and have 7 priests carry trumpets in front of it.' And he ordered the army, 'Advance, march around the city with an armed guard going ahead of the ark of the Lord.' When Joshua had spoken to the people, the 7 priests carrying the 7 trumpets before the Lord went forward, blowing their trumpets, and the ark of the Lord's covenant followed them. The armed guard marched ahead of the priests who blew the trumpets, and the rear guard followed the ark. All this time the trumpets were sounding. But Joshua had commanded the army, "Do not give a war cry, do not raise your voices, do not say a word, until the day I tell you to shout. Then shout." So he had the ark of the Lord carried around the city, circling it once. And then the army returned to camp and spent the night there. So they do this for 6 consecutive days. And it's very specific. You know, they're marching around the city. The men are carrying the Ark of the Covenant. The priests are blowing the trumpets. I mean, this is a really specific instructions. And you can almost imagine the people in the city maybe looking down from the wall and thinking, what in the world are these guys doing? Do they really think that they're going to defeat our walled, fortified city by marching around in circles? And so you could almost imagine the people of Jericho chuckling or laughing at the technique or the strategy of the Israelites here. And that brings up a really good point, I think, when we're thinking about what's right in front of us. Whether it's raising children, or going into marriage, or working on your marriage, or going to work, or in retirement or aging, we need to remember to do the things that the world thinks are ineffective, useless, offensive, or weird. God is going to call us to deal with what's right in front of us differently than what the world would do. If you're thinking about raising children, the world is going to tell you, let them watch anything they want. Let them eat anything that they want to eat. Let them do whatever they want to do. That's in essence what the world is. That's the direction that the world is taking. A hands-off approach. Which means that really, as you take your hands off, other people, other ideologies, other people are putting their hands on. And they are taking their agenda and they're raising your children with their ideas, their thoughts, their techniques. And so the world will look at a Christian and the way a Christian raises their children, the way that a Christian operates in the marriage relationship, the way that a Christian works, and the way that a Christian spends their retirement, and they'll say, "What are you doing? That's weird. That's strange. That's offensive." And it's because we are following what God has told us to do, and we're doing what He has told us we need to do in that context, in that situation. God told the Israelites, this is how you're going to deal with Jericho. And yeah, it's kind of strange. Yeah, it's probably not what other nations, it's not the strategy that they were using to defeat their enemies, but it's what God had told them to do. And it's important that as we think about what we're pressing into, what we're about to deal with, that we do the things that the world says are, ineffective, useless, offensive, or weird. It's okay to do those things. It's good to do those things. That's what God calls us to do. I want to just give you an example because I think this is really important. We looked at marriage a little bit, about how God calls wives to respect their husbands because men need respect to feel love. And husbands, love your wives. Wives need love to feel respected. And so it's kind of that vice versa thing. But there's specific instructions about children too. Take a look at Proverbs chapter 13. And let me know what you think. I think that this is a drastically different way to raise children than what the world is encouraging right now. But Proverbs 13:24 says, "Whoever spares the rod hates their children, but the one who loves their children is careful to discipline them." Now, that doesn't mean that you need to just, go crazy with a paddle or with a switch. You don't need to spank your kids every day for every little thing that they do. The idea there is that if you withhold discipline, if you don't set boundaries for your kids, then you don't like your children. You're not investing in them. You're not doing what's best for them. Now the world says, well, that's child abuse, but we're not talking about discipline in the sense of physical punishment. We're just talking about discipline in general. Flip over to Proverbs 22, verse 15. It says, folly is bound up in the heart of a child. So children can be silly. Children can be, hard-headed. They can do things that they probably shouldn't do. Folly is bound up in the heart of a child. But the rod of discipline will drive it far away. And so again, the rod of discipline, this idea that children need boundaries, they need to be disciplined. Sometimes it might require a spanking. Usually it probably requires some serious talk, some modeling, those kind of things. But that is what's best for children. Again, the world is going to say, well, you should take a hands-off approach. Don't be overbearing. You don't need to do that. And finally, in Proverbs 29:15, Proverbs is full of these just really practical advice for parents and children. 29 verse 15, a rod and a reprimand impart wisdom, but a child left undisciplined disgraces its mother. I encourage you to look at some of the confusion and the depression and issues that children are having at younger and younger ages in our culture, in American culture, and ask yourself, is that connected to a lack of discipline in the home? I think it probably is. And the world is doing what they see fit, what they think is right. As Christians, we need to do what God tells us to do. The same way that, he tells the Israelites, this is how you're going to take Jericho. It looks weird, it looks different, it's not what most other people are doing, but this is what you're going to do. So remember that whenever it is that you are, whatever it is that you're dealing with. Retirement is another big one. Use your retirement well. John Piper preaches this sermon way back in the 90s or early 2000s called Don't Waste Your Life. And I encourage you to listen to it if you're going into retirement, because the basic idea is that, Christians, we can retire from our job, but we don't retire from our faith. And it's important that our retirement is shaped by our faith in Jesus. How are we going to use that time where we're not working every single day to do something for the kingdom, to do something, for God? Okay, well, let's keep reading. Let's push forward a little bit. Verses 12 through 14, and then we'll look at 15 through 21. Joshua got up early the next morning. The priests took up the ark of the Lord. The 7 priests carrying the 7 trumpets went forward, marching before the ark of the Lord, blowing the trumpets. The armed men went ahead of them, and the rear guard followed the ark of the Lord while the trumpets kept sounding. So on the second day, they marched around the city once more, returned to the camp. They did this for 6 days. On the 7th day, they got up at daybreak and marched around the city 7 times in the same manner, except that on that day, they circled the city 7 times. The 7th time around, when the priest sounded the trumpet blast, Joshua commanded the army, shout, for the Lord has given you the city. The city and all that is in it are to be devoted to the Lord. Only Rahab the prostitute and all who are with her in her house shall be spared, because she hid the spies we sent. But keep away from the devoted things, so that you will not bring about your own destruction by taking any of them. Otherwise you will make the camp of Israel liable to destruction, and bring trouble on it. All the silver and gold and the articles of bronze and iron are sacred to the Lord, and must go into his treasury. So something's gonna happen during this battle where they take the city that we might draw some application from later on. But it's important to listen to those instructions. Don't take anything. Well, when the trumpet sounded, the army shouted, verse 20, at the sound of the trumpet, when the men gave a loud shout, the wall collapsed. So everyone charged straight in, and they took the city. They devoted the city to the Lord and destroyed it with a sword, every living thing in it, men and women, young and old, cattle, sheep, and donkeys. And so the last kind of important application thing that I want to bring out today is that when you are dealing with what's right in front of you and you know what God has told you to do, don't stop when you don't see results. So you notice that they had to march around the city once doing the same exact thing for 6 days in a row. And I'm willing to bet that there were some people in the army who were starting to think, what are we doing? They're laughing at us. We've got swords, we've got shields, we've got bows and arrows. Can we fire something off here? Can we do something? And it's that kind of tendency for us to get impatient when we don't see the results that we think we should be seeing. On the seventh day, they circled the city 7 times. Do you think maybe on the 6th time around, some of the people started to think, okay, let's change our strategy. Let's change our tactic. God told us to do this. Doesn't look like it's working. Let's do something else. When it comes to raising children, when it comes to work, when it comes to marriage, when it comes to really any of those things that are right in front of us, it might take a while for us to see the results that we hope for. It might take years. Does that mean that we should give up on what God has told us to do? Or the way that God has told us to do it? I don't think so. One of the important aspects of being a follower of Jesus is to be consistent, to be persevering, to not give up. And so it's easier to not discipline your children and just kind of, throw your hands up and do the hands-off approach. It's easier in marriage to just kind of settle for a divorce when you can't work things out. It's easier in retirement to just kind of sit back, relax, don't do anything. But is that what God is calling us to do? God calls us to raise children with discipline. God calls us to work through our issues in marriage. God calls us to work as if we were working for the Lord. God calls us, I think, in aging and in retirement, to do things for the kingdom with that time that we have. Is it easy? No. Are we going to see instant, amazing results? We might, but we might not. God calls us to be consistent. He calls us to keep doing what He's asked us to do, even when we don't see results. Galatians chapter 6, verse 9 is the last kind of illustration that I want to give here. It says in verse 9, "And let this be an encouragement to you, let us not become weary in doing good." So don't grow weary in well-doing. "For at the proper time we will reap a harvest if we do not give up." There is something good for us to do in all of the things, that are right in front of us. And as long as we don't grow weary in well-doing, as long as we don't give up, then we will reap a harvest of righteousness when the time is right. And God has timing for everything. And so in this story, I think it's really illustrated for us, and kind of the picture is painted for us, that we need to do those 3 things when we're thinking about dealing with what's right in front of us. And so I'll just remind you of what they are. Pay attention to what God says about specific things. Do things that the world thinks are ineffective, useless, offensive, or weird. And don't stop when you don't see results. All of that is demonstrated in this story where the town of Jericho is taken. And so I encourage you, as you're thinking about that thing that's right in front of you, and you're thinking about, okay, how am I going to deal with this? Look for the specific instructions. Don't stray from those. Do those things, even if it's kind of contrary to what the world says, or your friends say, or TV says. It's probably especially if it's what TV says. And don't give up when you don't see results. It's all about God's timing. Blessings.